is Chief WarHorse right? And the question revolves around the issue of, are the Moors the real indigenous American Indians? Yes, there is that question that is floating around out there, and there are all sorts of assertions that are being made about the true identity of the American Indians. And those who identify as Moorish have one narrative about the land, and those who identify as Indigenous American Indians have another narrative about the land. Now, while the American Indians don't dispute necessarily the idea that this is America, this landmass is something called America, those who identify as Moor identify this as a part of the Moroccan Empire. So it's a very interesting debate, if you will, that's going on there. And we're going to tackle some of these questions and see if we can look at this issue from both sides. Now, there are some, really conflated dynamics going on in terms of identity. But one thing that is noted is that the individuals, the groups, the nations that are identified by treaty and just by history as this being their land, they have a narrative that says that they were here and the Moors came over with the other Europeans and colonized. And so we're going to look to see if there's any credence to what the Moors are saying in terms of them being here first, and then we're going to look to see if there's any credence in what Chief WarHorse and what the other Indian tribes are saying, like the Powhatan and the Narragansett and all of them. We're going to look to see what we can see on both sides of this equation. Now, there is the temptation to approach this issue from a purely historical standpoint, but because of the number of issues that are involved in this identity dynamic, you really have to look at this from a legal standpoint, from an anthropological standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, a religious standpoint, and then ultimately a psychological standpoint, because we're talking about identity and dynamics around identity. Now, although individuals who identify as Moorish identify themselves as having been the creators of the Western civilization on the western side of the Atlantic, history basically supports another dynamic. And so the historical narrative, the standard historical narrative is that the Moors were the medieval Muslim inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula. And so that would be present day Portugal and Spain, and also parts of Western Africa. And so in Europe, Moors were basically thought of as anyone with Arab descent, or they were African descent, and they also were often referred to as blackamoors. And if you've seen the edict by Queen Elizabeth, you can see where she identifies when she's saying that she wants them out of her realm. She is basically identifying what she calls nigars and blackamoors, and she's identifying them as two different groups. So that's important to note also. And she's basically saying Negroes. So whoever the blackamoors were, in her estimation, they were distinct from whoever the Negroes were, in her estimation. Nevertheless, she wanted them all out of her realm. Now, some espouse the belief that the Muslim Jews and Christians were all coexisting peacefully and getting along, but there is another history that's a little earlier than Queen Elizabeth. And so around the 700 time frame, there was an invasion of Europe, and the Christians in Europe identified this as an act of aggression. And so the Moors invaded parts of Europe and took over, and they pretty much ran Europe for about 700 years. And then there was the reconquering of Europe. It's unclear if there was really a reconquering, or who all of these different groups were, because there's a lot of conflation going on there too. Interestingly, this reconquering coincides with Christopher Columbus, or whatever his name is. It coincides with him doing his traveling. And so you have all of these different histories going along together, and you have some divergence. And also, there is the notation that when the Muslims and Jews were kicked out of that southern part of Europe, that they went down, descended into West Africa, and pretty much went unnoticed. Now, there is some discrepancy about how much they went unnoticed and how much they actually blended in, or how much they stood out. There are some questions about the skin color dynamics, the racial dynamics, and whether or not they really blended in, or whether or not they played some other role. And so far, it's a little difficult to make that leap into the Moors actually being the creators of the Western civilization that the Indians occupy at this time, and at the time that Christopher Columbus purportedly showed up on the shores. And so it's a little difficult to make that leap that this is what took place, but again, that is the assertion. Now, I think it's pretty important that people make note of the fact that there is a lot of mystery regarding this situation. And so Moorishness itself is shrouded in mystery. There's no clear-cut understanding of who is a Moor, what is Moorish. Sometimes Moor is about race, sometimes Moor is about religion, sometimes there's this conflation where it's an ethno-religious dynamic. And then you sometimes have Moorish identity wrapped up in ambiguity related to race, and also the indication that the Moors were probably integral to the dynamic of having these fixed races, or sort of mid-races, in Arabic countries, and also in what are considered Hispanic countries in the West. And so in that way, they sort of are also the poster children for sort of colorist ideologies and all of that ambiguity that goes on in many parts of the world, where you have this, the one drop rule, and you have all of this mixed race identity. And there's also a relationship between Arabic languages and Spanish. And so there are a lot of loan words, so very interesting dynamic there. But one thing that tends to follow, Moorish history, as you're following the Moors throughout history, is, there is this dynamic of them being non-pagan, or sort of anti-pagan, civilized, elevated, over other groups, particularly indigenous groups. So it's kind of interesting to, have someone identify as indigenous, but also elevated over the indigenous people, which tend to be viewed as uncivilized, whether you're talking about Africa or whether you're talking about America. Okay, and so there's also this narrative, this history of being invading and conquering, encroaching. There's that pattern that goes on throughout history. And they also have the narrative, the history of being major slave traders, whether you're talking about across Africa, between Europe and Africa. You've got the Barbary Coast, you've got Trans-Saharan, you've got Transatlantic, you've got people going into Asia. And so they were very busy people, very, very busy. And so this issue of identity conflation is not something new, because with the Inquisition and with the casting out, there was this creation of these hidden identities for both the Moors and the Jews. And they became what are known as the Conversos and the Moranos and the Moriscos. And it also sort of ties into that word maroon. But at any rate, so you have these entities that in Europe, they had to take on, in many instances, new identities. So they had to pretend to be Christians, specifically Catholic. They had to pretend to be Catholic in order to stay in the land, but they were often secretly still practicing their religions, and they were called New Christians. And so what this means historically, in terms of the historic narrative, is sometimes when you hear that the Catholics did this or the Catholics did that, after this time period, you don't really know whether or not it was the Catholics who did it, or whether or not it was, you know, a converso who was doing it, a Marrano or Morisco. You really don't know. And so there was, again, this interesting pattern of conflating identities. And what this also means, and people don't touch on this, is there are implications for this in terms of race and religion. Okay, and so you have individuals who are likely very brown. Who knows exactly how brown? But they were brown. And in some instances, they were very light. However, what ended up happening is that these individuals, these two groups, the conversos, Marranos, Moriscos, they were doing things in the name of Catholicism. They were doing things in the name of whiteness. And so sometimes what ended up happening was that those would be identified as white and Christian would end up taking the responsibility on and the guilt, the culpability for things that might have been done by individuals who may not have been white and who may not have been Catholic. And so, of course, that's important to note in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and the other slave trades that were going on. And it might be why there was so much confusion about who was doing what. And we've said all that to say we still do not have an indication that these individuals are the same people as the Native Americans, as the Indians, as the Aboriginal people of the Western lands. Now, this is a really interesting article. So you've got little snippets from this article. It's an interesting article out of Ghana. And Ghana basically, this writer was Atto, Ghana is basically saying, look, they are not going to take the full responsibility for what took place during the transatlantic slave trade, and they are implicating the Marranos, the Conversos, the Moriscos in this dynamic. And they talk about them being Lancados and then their children. And so when there was this descending into Africa from Southern Europe, what basically Ghana is saying is that these individuals, these men, intermarried with the local women, and often they intermarried with the royalty. So they intermarried with the princesses. Okay, so they would intermarry with them and then create children, of course. And then those children would be used as go-betweens. And so they would serve as both, you know, they'd be Portuguese and Spanish. They could be white and black. So these were their mulatto children who, over time, for many of them, they continued to marry back into the native population. And so they became darker and darker again. But they still had that paternal identity. And so these were the individuals that they say were basically running a good portion of the slave trade. And so unlike today's understanding of what a mulatto is, mulatto in Africa is not necessarily considered the same. And so it's basically someone of mixed heritage, but it's not someone that you can just readily identify as having mixed heritage. The person may be very, very dark, and there may be no indication of what you would consider white European heritage. However, they still have the inheritance of the father, and they still have that linkage to Spain, to Portugal, to France, to Great Britain. Now, interestingly to note, the same dynamic is reported as having gone on in the Americas. And so you had the Lancados and the other Europeans and the Africans that came over willingly and intermarried with some of the Native American Indian people. and did some of this same stuff where they were then speaking for the people. So they'd taken on the identity of the people and were speaking for them. It is probable that a lot of the treaties that took place between these entities and the governmental entities. And so it's possible that in many instances, when people think that it was the Native Americans, the Indians who made the treaties, it could have actually been, if you can imagine this, it could have been the people who were the settlers who married in. It could be them creating treaties with themselves for the benefit of themselves. And that might be why you have so many Native Americans, so many Indian tribes that got the short end of the stick, because they really were not doing their own negotiating. It was basically people who kind of sort of look like them, or maybe not even kind of sort of look like them, but people who had taken on their identity and then they were speaking for them. And so this might be a big part of the reason why you have people who are identifying as Moorish in the United States, perhaps continuing to take on that role of, it almost sounds like usurping identity. The big phrase that's been going around is this sort of cultural appropriation, this identity appropriation. It's been working so far, and so maybe people think that it can continue to work. And this, make note of this, this is the problem with creating allegiance basically only based upon skin color. And so you have all of these people talking about everyone needs to unify. All of the black people need to unify. Most of these quote unquote black people don't even know who all of the black people are that they are talking about unifying with. And clearly, based upon Ghana's discussion, they are basically saying that just because someone has black skin, just because someone has brown skin, does not mean that they are the same as the next person who is sitting next to them who also has brown skin. Their ancestry often determines their socio-political and cultural and sometimes spiritual agenda. So their agendas are going to be colored, using that word, pun intended, are going to be colored by their underlying ancestry. And so this may help to understand how you might have some descendants, some Moorish descendants, seeing themselves as Indian. And of course, there may be an issue of intermarrying, so they may be Indian. But the idea that they are, in their Moorish identity, the original inhabitants, is questionable based upon what the American Indians are saying, and even when you look at history. And so you can entertain that argument, but there is evidence to suggest that maybe something else is going on. But we also do need to look to see if there is any historical evidence of the Moors being considered part of any American Indian tribes, nations, groups prior to colonization. And so we're going to look to see if there are any Indian tribes that actually have them in their roles, or that are actually identifying as Moors. And so we're going to look at the Nanticoke for that exploration. Okay, now on the Nanticoke Museum and Learning Center website, you can actually look at this timeline here. There is a timeline of historical highlights. And of course, the assertion is that the Moors came over with the settlers, with the colonizers. And so we're going to look to see if we can find any evidence of this. Now, in this timeline, we don't see any mention of the Moors from 1608 all the way down to 1682 so far, with the signing of the peace treaty with William Penn. But we're going to proceed on and see if we see any indication. And off to the right, you can see someone who is dressed in Moorish attire, depicting a Moor. And that attire looks substantially inconsistent with the depictions of the Indian artifacts. Okay, now further down the line here in 1855, we start to see mention of the Moors. It's very interesting because there are distinctions made between the Moors and those entities that would be considered white, those entities that would be considered Negro, and there is apparently some sort of conflating going on with the Moors and the Indian community. And it even says the term Moor is used to refer to the Indian community when you're looking at 1877 of Cheswall and the general Indians of each of the communities in that area. And interestingly, there's even a school that's built just for the children who have been identified as the Moors. Now, interestingly, back in 1748, there was a lot of European encroachment and hostility related to the Nanticoke. And so they had to flee from the area that they were in and move inward. And it's noted that they became many of them became part of a remnant tribal community that was distinct from their original tribal community. Now, if you look down at 1888, there was a historian, Scharf, who identified the so-called Moors as being a distinct ethnic group at least as early as a century ago. And so this is someone who's saying that this was actually a distinct ethnic group approximately at the later end of the 18th century. One of the things that's interesting, again, is the attire of the entity who is identified as a Moor off to the right. And here you have mentioned in 1892 the Kent County Moors, and this appears in the Times of Philadelphia. And there's also a mention that there's a belief that the term Moor is misleading. And John Saunders is basically saying from the Cheswall community that we are Indians and we belong to a branch of the Great Delaware Indians. And so this person is saying basically this is a misnomer. And then in 1896, the Smyrna Press suggested that perhaps in keeping with looking at the other article, that the name came from the town known as Moortown, and so people were simply named after the town is one assertion here. Now, some communications with the Smithsonian indicate that the name Moor has been used a number of times in terms of correspondence about the Indian group along the eastern seaboard. Okay, so that's 1897. And as you look down, you don't see any more mention of the Moors down to the time period 1912. So let's continue on and see what we see here. Okay, again, here is mention of the Moors again related to the Cheswall tribal community. And then in 1921, there is again mention of a school for children of people called the Moors. And in this school, no white or colored children will be permitted to attend the school without permission of the Board of Trustees and the State Board of Education. So it's a very interesting dynamic going on there. So the Moors basically were not considered white and they were not considered colored. And so then in 1930, there is an identification of people in terms of census records as Nanticoke, mixed or Indian, and There's also an interesting dynamic here that goes to the issue that keeps coming up with people when they're doing their research, is that a census worker apparently decided to reclassify people who were classified on the census as Nanticoke, mixed, or Indian. Individual illegally crossed that out and then misclassified them and indicated that the Indians were either African or Negro. And then in 1935, you have an interesting dynamic in the Delaware Code where it equates, then in codified language here, equates the Moors as Indians. And again, providing schooling for them that is separate from white children and colored children. And even more interesting, if you go down to 1972, you'll note that on the driver's license, between the time period of 1950 and 1970 had a specific designation for Moor, which was M on the driver's license. And so you have here an interesting conflation where you have the Moors being identified as the Indians, and then those who originally were identified as Nanticoke Indian, mixed, or Indian, those entities were reclassified as African or Negro. And so this is an interesting play in terms of identity. And also, it also looks almost like a paper genocide in many ways. And as you can see here, apparently Delaware took some steps in 1740 to define Indian as anyone who was considered a non-Christian who was living in the woods and primarily eating deer meat. And then New Jersey attempted to eradicate the notion of there even being Indians by claiming a termination of all treaty obligations in relation to the indigenous people. Now, in keeping with some of the oral narratives of entities such as the Virginia Indians, the Choctaw, the Indians who were baptized as Christian, and those who adopted Western clothing and names and housing, they were no longer considered Indian in public documents, and then their identity was changed again to free people of color, colored, and mulatto. And this became even more problematic because the Indians were being enslaved in the various states. And there was also a quote-unquote white racial bias where there was a lot of stereotyping going on, and those who would be considered quote-unquote mixed race Indians, they would be reclassified as mulatto or Negro, and it didn't matter what their actual ethnic identity was or what their actual individual genealogy happened to be. And one of the things the museum is noting is that this dynamic continues on today. And so there is this dynamic of classifying people as Negro, person of color, mulatto, a whole sundry of classifications there, colored, anything other than Indian, and that this is related to some type of racial bias. And so, in other words, their identity is being stolen and has been stolen apparently for centuries now. Okay, so we have the Honorable George Fisher, who basically says, he's going to get down to the bottom of, who the Moors are. And he says the so-called Moors of Delaware, who are they? And so he wrote on this. This was back in 1895. And so we're going to look at this. And there again is another picture of a Moor. Usually the attire is very fancy, very European looking, and sometimes even when in Africa, very, very ornate, and with lots of volume and lots of material. And so it does tend to contrast with what you might think of when you identify someone who is traditionally considered American Indian. And in this text, you have a discussion about how those of Moorish identity can play the role of Indian slave. They can play the role of Indian, and it's related to this idea of blackness. One of the important things mentioned in talking about masking race is this issue of Indians having a different religious paradigm, having a different spiritual tradition than those who would be identified as Moors. And it seems as though the connecting factor in terms of the identity has to do with closeness in terms of skin color. And so even though you're learning that the Moors traditionally had what would be considered a sort of yellow undertones and the Indians having more red undertones, there is still that recognition of them having quote unquote similar blackness. Okay, so we're going to go back to our Slave Voyages website. Now, of course, the individuals who are identifying as Moor are also identifying as being indigenous. But what is noted is that there was notation about individuals identifying as Moor and also slave ships bearing the name of Moor. And so you see a number of slave ships with the name Moor. You even see the Black Moor, and that slave ship was sailing in 1731. So from 1639 all the way to 1744, you will note that there are slaving vessels with the name Moor in them. And what we also have here is a look at names, and so individual names of people who were enslaved. And so we see that there are a number of individuals with the name Moor inside of their name. Now, many people might say that that's because Moor means dark. What's interesting, though, is that if you do the same thing with the word Negro, you do not get results. And so even though both might mean similar things in terms of dark or black, you don't see names with Negro in terms of being shipped out of Africa. And of course, now it is noted that all of these individuals were basically caught up in that time when slavery had been technically ended in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. And so they were disembarking in Freetown. But for the African name Negro, there is no time period that we could find. Now, what we have here is an interesting finding. So this is the Passenger and Immigration List Index, and there are several of them. But what you will notice is even though you had very few people identified as Moor in Africa, you did have some, but you had very few people. And consistent with what the American Indian tribes and nations are saying now regarding who the Moors really are, this passenger and immigration list, primarily related to European immigration into the quote-unquote New World, you will see a large number of individuals with the surname Moor. And this is Moor with and without the E at the end. So there's a significant number, just simply the traditional way of understanding Moor as M-O-O-R. And you can see that individuals were in the United States pretty early. You can see the 1600s, you can see people in the 1700s, you can see people even in the let's see, you see 1700s, you see the 1800s. And so you can see all the way to the 1800s. So you can see 1913. And with this book, if anyone is interested in using this type of book, you basically have the surname, you have the first name, you also have family members. If family members came over with the person. You see that. You see the year that the event took place. And you can see where the event took place. And so you can see there's a lot going on in Virginia, in Charleston, South Carolina, again, more Virginia. You see Pennsylvania. You can also see an indication of the book, and so you can see where information is held and the page inside of that resource. And so it may be something such as a land grant, it may be that they were simply on a ship, but you can see based upon these dates, all of these 1600 dates, that these were basically pilgrims. Okay, and so you had Moors who were early settlers. Okay, and of course, this historical narrative comports more reasonably with them being immigrants. The mode of dress, all of that goes along with that narrative much more than them being Native American Indians. Okay, and again, here you can see, a fairly long list, and this is just in one book, and so you can see again 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 1600s. Again, lots of people coming in the 1600s, and so very early in the period of colonizing, and very much going to Virginia. And so these would be the individuals, these would be the groups that would be in conflict with the Indians, would be a part of the colonizing of that area, of settling that area. And so sometimes when you hear about you hear about all of these Moors, and you hear about all of the Negroes, you hear about all of the black people, quote unquote black people, that were settling there, and how some were indentured servants and some were enslaved, and there's a lot of confusion about that identity. This may be the reason for that, because many of them actually were settlers. Many of them, as you can see, came with wife and children. And so this is not a dynamic of people being enslaved and brought over. In many of these instances, many of these individuals were property owners and also became slave owners themselves. And so again, you have this really difficult conflating of identities where people are presumed to have been a slave or enslaved simply because they had darker skin. And historically, even when you look at descendants now, you might have descendants of people who were Moors, and they are automatically going to take on that descendant of American chattel slavery identity when they don't necessarily have proof that that is their true heritage. Because clearly there were a significant number of people who were dark. That's how these surnames came about. Surnames were descriptors. So your name might be Baker if you're a baker, farmer if you're a farmer, Moor if you're darker. Okay, and so you'll have people taking on these identities of enslaved person descendants, when in fact it's possible that that is not really their narrative. And that's why it's important for people to do their own individual ancestral tracing. People tend to have this, kumbaya, everyone must be together, everyone must have the same narrative, and people are getting very uncomfortable about the possibility that people may have different narratives. And it's unclear what that's all about, but it is there. And so again, people need to be comfortable with allowing other people to have their own narrative. And when you look on the screen, you see why this is important. Not everyone was enslaved. And people will talk about reparations, but the fact is that many people do not and will not have standing to receive any reparations based upon the actual narrative for their specific ancestors. Their specific ancestors in many instances may have, as you recall from the equity discussion, may have very unclean hands. And so again, this simply backs up what Chief WarHorse is saying, what the Virginia Indian groups are saying, what the Northeast Woodland Indians Americans are saying about their relationship with the Moors. And so it is probably not a good idea to continue down that path of trying to conflate the identities of these groups. Each group has its own unique heritage, its own unique narrative. And it needs to be okay for both of those groups to have their own unique heritages. Now, clearly, because people were doing a lot of mixing, people were swirling back then. Okay, so because people were doing a lot of mixing, it is possible for someone to have both indigenous Indian heritage and Moorish heritage. And it is possible for someone to have been Moorish and also find themselves in a Native American Indian tribe and even perhaps relocated with that tribe. And so this isn't saying that there wasn't any mixing. It is simply saying, though, that the entity that goes back to pre-colonial times, those are the American Indians. Those entities who came, well, you could say came after Columbus, they came after Columbus. Those who came after Columbus or with Columbus would be those identified as Moor. Now, when you look at the screen, you see the bayou. This is the Louisiana Bayou, and this is Chief WarHorse's area. And when you look at the upper left-hand corner, you see the Moors, and clearly with a very European appearance. And you look at the bayou, and you ask yourself, when you look at all of the pictures on the screen, you look at the 3 pictures on the screen, which of these entities looks like that is their native land? Who looks like they are the native son or daughter of that land? Who looks like they would be comfortable in the area where the alligators roam? So the question that we started off with is Chief WarHorse, and by extension, many of the other Indian nations, are they right about who they are and who they are in relation to the Moors? And the answer to that question is clearly yes. And one of the things that people are going to have to start working on is finding their own heritage. There is no overarching umbrella for all brown people in the Americas. Just because your skin is brown or just because your skin is cream does not automatically translate to you having the same heritage as the person who is next to you. It needs to be okay to be whoever you are and to have whatever narrative your history takes you down. It is not okay to take on the identity of other people, and it's even more egregious to try to change the identity of the people, because when a person takes on an identity that is not their own, they are also, by extension, attempting to assert that the identity of the people that they are taking on, that their identity is not legitimate. And so when people insist that they are the Choctaw, when they are not the Choctaw, and they are insisting that they are the Narragansett, when they are not the Narragansett, it creates a problem. And many people are not willing to do the work. They just want to jump from this understanding of their identity as not being something East. And then they want to just jump to being Aboriginal without clearly showing, without clearly tracing their individual heritage. spending time on YouTube debating about whether or not black or brown people are the indigenous people is not the route to go down. The route to go down is finding out each person's individual ancestry. That is the most important thing. It's not community building. It's not, creating coalitions. That's not the thing, because you don't know for sure until you know for sure who your people are. Those who are familiar with Louisiana, have ever been to Louisiana, will know that one of the first things that people in Louisiana want to know when they meet you often is, who are your people? And that's the question that many of you need to be asking yourself. Who are your people? You don't have to worry about who anyone else's people are. The question is, who are your people? Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon. And this is for Chief WarHorse.